Welcome to the Hero Report podcast. We're really doing something here. This is the third one in about a month. That's not too bad.
It's compared with last year, we've already exceeded our total.
Yeah, well, that's pretty terrific. I guess that's what having a Patreon audience will do for us.
It is.
Um, Look, we've talked the last couple of times. We've ended up talking about movies the past couple of times. This time, I want to get a little bit um, into the details of heroism with you. I want to run some ideas by you that I've been thinking about, see what you think, and then see what our audience thinks as well. Because I'm working on a paper, and quite frankly, I have these ideas in my head. I need to test them out, and I need to get people's thoughts on them before I write them all down. So I'll give you a little background, and we'll go from there. You tell me what you think. A long time ago, at this point, I researched and published a book on different kinds of heroism, and I set out a couple of commonalities that I think that heroes have, and we've talked about these a lot. Obviously, this idea of taking a risk or making a big sacrifice, I think, is integral to heroism. Um, Doing this on behalf of a principle, I think, is integral to heroism. Having an appreciation, reflecting on one's mortality, the limits of one's life, I think is important for heroism. But of course, these are characteristics that we could say characterize not only heroes, but also villains. You would be able to tick off a lot of those same boxes. I think all of those same boxes if you were talking about people who do things that we don't approve of at all. And, so what would be the difference between heroes and villains? And we started talking about this a long time ago. The easy and obvious answer is to say that heroes do things that are good and villains do things that are bad. This is obviously pretty straightforward, except it gets into this realm where things are or can be considered a bit more relative than I might like. Good for whom? Bad for whom? Right? According to which person is something good or bad? When we have that problem, it makes heroism and villainy very much in the eye of the beholder alone. And for me, at least, that's problematic. So what I've been trying to think about is a way to get around this problem of relativism. If there's a way to say, this is something that it makes someone objectively a hero and not a villain. And there are some ways you could do this, right? Certainly you can talk about heroes acting on behalf of others, as I try to do in the book when I talk about what we might call moral heroism, moral courage. These are people with an expansive sense of who counts as one of us, right? These are people whose circle of empathy or circle of care is expansive. But that kind of a definition doesn't take into account a lot of the classical heroes that I wrote about and that I became, first interested in, because those are people who were not acting on behalf of others, but who I think people would say are nonetheless, classically at least, heroic. So I find myself trying to think about what it would be, what characteristic there might be that would distinguish heroes from villains once and for all, that we could say empirically, right? We could test this. Here's a set of heroes and here's a set of villains, and we see that there is this distinction between those two things. And what I hit on, I don't remember if I was sleeping or driving or wandering around campus, but what I hit on is this idea that I want to talk with you a little bit about. That is the idea that fundamentally heroism is emergent, right? I've written about this before. I know we've talked about this before. Heroism requires a situation to occur, that is outside of the control of the hero, right? So a hero, in some sense, is fundamentally reactive, right? Is dealing with, is responding to these circumstances, and I want to suggest the same might not be true about people who act in a way that we would describe as villainous. I'll stop there and see what you think.
So I think importantly, we need to start with what we mean by villain, because I think even more than the term hero, that one is tough to define for an average person, or to describe an average person, where it's outside of movies or comic books. I mean, I think villain is very loaded with comic books, more, yeah, even more so than heroes. And even with hero, I still get frequently during interviews questions about how does this relate to superheroes. So what how are you describing a villain in this situation?
That's a great question. I think that I probably need to think a little bit about what we mean by villainy as well. But I think that I'm likely to be at least somewhat expansive here in thinking about villainy, right? I think that it's people who are actively doing something. It's not just a bystander, for example, right? I know that you, for example, love to say that the opposite of heroism isn't villainy, but the opposite of a hero is a bystander. I think that there's something quite true about that. But I also think that there is this different category, of the person who does wrong, right? Who does harm. I mean, the obvious examples are the terrorist, and the murderer. Those sorts of things are the very clear examples of villainy. When we think about the quintessential moral hero, we think about the Holocaust rescuer. When we think about the quintessential moral villain, we think of the Nazi, the committed Nazi. Those are the clear examples. And I think in each of those cases, you have someone who is proactively taking some action, and rather than kind of reacting to a bad situation, this is a person who is creating the bad situation, right?
Okay.
It is because of the villain that you need the hero.
So the examples you were giving there seemed to involve death of someone else. Is a thief a villain?
I think at a certain level, yes. I don't know if the person who, steals the wallet, or picks up the laptop that someone left behind to go get a coffee, is a villain. I think the person who scams, hundreds of people out of their retirement savings, that's a different story, right? I think maybe this is something about scale for me. But I think we could probably play this game on a smaller scale if we wanted to. At least at this stage, I'm not doing that.
So I wonder, I hear you say that it's scale, but I wonder if you're being influenced already by the distinction between proactive and reactive. Is it, what if someone is, so you say swiping a laptop, what if the person is actively, regularly stealing laptops as a part of an ongoing plan, and has various cafes that they know people are leaving laptops out all the time? Is it, yeah, I mean, what do you think the scale is?
Yeah, that's enough. Sure.
So
Why not?
is it enough because
Right.
it's proactive, or is it enough because it's bigger?
No, I think it's bigger, right? I think it's not in that case. It's not simply like the crime of opportunity. where someone makes because in a sense I'm not, at least in this paper, I'm not thinking about the split second hero, right? I'm thinking about people with a kind of who are in a sense doing something that is bigger and requires more. Um, in either case, you have planning, right? Whether it's the hero or the villain that I'm thinking of here, you have planning in both of those cases. It's not simply, I also was in the coffee shop and I noticed that you got up and left your laptop, so I swiped it and walked out the door. I've never done it before. I'll never do it again. But the situation you're describing is someone with a plan.
So are you eliminating from the hero discussion then the person that chases down that person that stole the laptop?
At least for the moment.
Okay.
I don't know that there's any problem if I include both as a hero and a villain, now that I'm thinking about it, now that you're challenging me on it, because in both cases you have proactive, reactive. So I think it still fits. And, you still have risk. But, in those cases, there's obviously a lot. I mean, there isn't, at least for the villain, there's no principle there.
Right.
Right. There's no, right. The motive is simply like, get rich quick or take something that's not yours. Right. In the bigger cases that I'm thinking of, there might be something more driving. And that's why I kind of steered away from theft, because I'm not sure if these cases, even big cases of theft, have things like principle behind them, apart from the principle of I want more money, or something like that, which isn't really.
But what about the principle behind murder? Was the other example you gave? I can see the terrorism part, but where does the murder part come into that, or murderer?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because there's all sorts of different motives for that, as we see on
Unquestioned.
NCIS.
Yes, I'm not much of a watcher of those kinds of shows, but I think you're right. And so even there, right, I'm thinking of, I mean, again, this is my training as a political scientist, right? I'm thinking of political killing, right? I'm not thinking about one-off, the one-off murderer, right? In the same way, I'm not thinking of the one-off thief.
Okay, so the villains that we're talking about also have some sort of philosophy or cause behind their actions.
Yeah, I think in order to be a villain, right? I think you can be a plenty bad person. You can be, someone who does terrible things, or a terrible thing. But the distinction, right? The problem for me is how we separate out the people who do things that we think of as very bad, but who have all the same characteristics of the hero.
Okay, so can you list out the characteristics again?
Yeah, so at least off the top of my head, I'm thinking about commitment to a principle, dedication to a principle, or a sort of an idea bigger than the person. I'm thinking about someone who takes a very serious risk or makes a very serious sacrifice. I'm thinking about someone who has a kind of, you know, well, I mean, I think even the mortality piece falls into that risk or sacrifice, that these are people who are willing to put their lives on the line in order to do this thing that they feel is bigger than them, that they're called to do or required to do.
Okay.
And I think that's the kind of situation where I can see someone who does a big bad thing. People could say, well, the only reason you don't see this I mean, what I want to get around, right, what drives this paper is standing against the notion that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Right.
Right. I think this is something that really plagues any discussion of heroism, and I think that I at least want us to be able to have a good reason why that's not true, and not simply we don't prefer terrorism, right? We select against it.
So this is a regular question for us certainly, and I think probably anyone else who's working in heroism and teaching heroism is that question of, well, isn't a terrorist a Hitler, or Hitler almost always, isn't Hitler a hero to some people, or isn't ISIS a heroic endeavor for some people? And I think in the past, the question has tried to be answered with some question about intent, which is hard really for us to quantify. But the intent of, well, this person's doing it for the good of others, but they're not hurting others to do so, I think has been the general answer. But I think often that question is coming from someone who's trying to trick us or trip us up in the first place. So that's the question we're trying to answer more deliberately. So the answer that you're proposing is that heroes react to a situation, whereas villains are planning it,
Yeah, I
regardless
think
of
that's
any situation. They're planning actions.
yeah, they're actively doing a thing, right? They're putting something out into the world, um, and the hero is reacting. And I think that's true even of heroes who plan, right? Because as we've talked about, the Holocaust rescuer has to have a plan. You cannot be engaged in that kind of systemic resistance for any period of time without not just a plan, but with multiple people all working in a coordinated way. If you read the rescuer stories, that's what you see over and over again. And so their plan, I mean, there's no doubt they're planning, but it's all fundamentally reactive, right? They wouldn't be planning anything at all if they didn't find themselves in the situation they find themselves in, right? And the same is not true on the other side, because these are people who are planning in order to make a situation occur.
Okay, so I've got two thoughts to that maybe perhaps counter to this, but maybe you can work them out. So the first is an ISIS example or a terrorist example. They would suggest that they're reacting to imperialism or to American expansionism or invasion or bombing. So how do we get around that?
It's a good question.
Do you want me to ask the second question?
Yep.
So, and I think I asked this the other day. So the other part is that, is there a point when a hero, a reactive hero of this type, stops being reactive and starts becoming proactive? So someone who's doing this over time, whether it's an Irina Sendler or a Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela, these big people who've done something reactive. They're reacting to a situation for sure, but at some point, do they become proactive in their risky pro-social action for a cause?
Okay. Those are good questions. I think that the first question about ISIS obviously requires a lot of unpacking, because, of course, the circumstances there are a bit more nebulous in some way, right? The thing that you're reacting to, well, I don't know. It's a good question.
And
it's a really good question.
I mean, it depends on maybe where you are in the pyramid as well, right? So if you are joining ISIS because your family was just blown up at a funeral by an American bomb, that's different to someone at the top of the pyramid who knows, doing it for power, doing it for anger, religion, or maybe retaliation, whatever it might be. There's
Right.
different motivations there, and even looking at Hitler as the common example. So how much do we really know about what his motivations were. Was he reacting to the crappy deal that the Germans received after World War One, or was he after power? Was he, you know, it's really hard to tell, right?
Yeah.
Was he reacting, or was he taking advantage of a situation?
Well, I think that's not reaction, right? That it seems to me, in terms of the things that were done, I don't know if they qualify as reaction to that particular
True. Yeah.
situation, right? So one can say, well, we have to do something in response to the bad terms of the peace deal of 1919. But I think that, for example, mass murder isn't the typical
Right.
reaction, right?
Right.
And I think the same is true when we talk about coming up with a kind of ISIS style terroristic response as well, right? It seems to me that the reaction to if your reaction is to American imperialism or Western imperialism or whatever, the targeting of civilians all over the world isn't. I mean, that's the kind of proactive planning that moves the field of battle from a traditional one where one is reacting to a military situation to a non-traditional one where one attacks civilians anywhere one can indiscriminately, with no connection to the original circumstances that were perhaps causing people to join up or whatever the case may be. I think that maybe I want to say that's a distinction. That's something proactive and not reactive. I don't know. I might be grasping.
Yeah. I think it depends what's available to them as a reaction, right? I mean, it's not available to them to retaliate against the people who dropped the bomb or did the whatever, or invaded their country or whatever it might be. Then those people aren't available in a reactionary way, and that they would argue
Well,
that they're not targeting the civilians; they're targeting the nation.
maybe. I mean, I think that's certainly what they might want to argue. I don't know if I buy into it. I
But
can
that's where we
see
get
why
back
you would
into
say such a
the
thing.
same
Yeah.
answer that we've been giving for the last 10 years. Is it's down to collateral damage and intent, or whether that's an acceptable action. I mean,
Right.
I'm arguing to argue here. I'm not, by no means am I defending those actions, and I think that's always been my answer: is if you have to kill or hurt a bunch of other people who are innocent, essentially, that's not heroism. It's not heroism if you have to hurt other people to do whatever your intended response is. So it's if you have to kill 10 people to save one person, that's not heroic. If you're killing people for a cause, that's not heroic. And like I said, that's kind of been the stock answer for the last 10 years.
Yeah,
But
and so
it's
maybe I'm just overthinking this and looking for something more than I need to. I mean, initially that is the answer that I was going with. It seems too easy. It seems too much to be, just my preference or something.
so flipping it
But
around. Are there people who are regularly described as heroes who did kill or injure others for their heroic outcome?
yes,
Like,
Well, the first example is one that I've been puzzling out with my co-author, and that's the example of Robert McBride in South Africa, who he was he was in prison and ultimately was released after the regime change in the early 90s. Applied for amnesty to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was with the ANC and he bombed a bar and killed and injured all kinds of white South Africans. And his defense was that he made no distinction between a military and a non-military target, that he saw all white South Africans as agents of his oppression and oppression of black and colored South Africans. And he's, I think, certainly in South Africa, amongst black South Africans, was lauded as a hero.
So how is that different to an ISIS bombing where they're lauded by others as heroes?
Yeah, I mean,
That's
I
the
think
question.
it's not heroic, right?
Who
I
does?
think it wasn't heroic. People on his team.
Right. So outside of his team, I mean, that's part of it as well, isn't it? Is the judgment of heroism? Well, we've always said it's an attribution, but does the attribution need to come from neutral observers?
Yeah, I don't know, right? But I think it's easy globally to get swept up in the notion that the ANC was right and the National Party was wrong. And so they were at war and they were, they were the insurgents, right? But they were fighting for the thing that was right. And while they certainly might have done things that, they wouldn't have done at other times, it was heroic to stand up against the regime and to fight for their freedom and their rights. And I could see McBride getting lumped in with, Mandela.
But I think, I mean, the question for me is like, what's the purpose of bombing a bar, and what's the hoped for outcome? I mean, just because they're at war doesn't mean that actions, even if their side is lauded as the correct side and unquestionably the right winner, it doesn't make all actions within the war appropriate.
No, I see. I think we're on the same page, right? I think that that's all correct, right? For me, it's not just what I was thinking I could say was that the problem with McBride is not simply the choice of his target, right? The indiscriminate killing, which I find really problematic personally, but also that it's this proactive plan to go out and do this thing rather than to be a resistor.
But what about Irina Sendler? I mean, she proactively chose to rescue children. Or Nicholas Winton, he saw the problem and then formulated a plan to save hundreds of children. It wasn't. Yeah, I mean that was also planned, right?
Well, if they don't act, those people die.
Right.
Right? Because of some action that someone else is already taking. Whereas if McBride doesn't act, nothing happens. Right? People go to the bar, they have drinks, and they go home. If he acts on, in some other way, it could be he does something heroic, right? But what he does instead is he's the one who sets the action in motion.
Right. But his argument is that he was reacting because he was in a war, right?
Right. I think that's right. And that's where my problem is. How to figure out where the chain begins or where it ends.
Right. Because, I mean, Sendler could have done any number of things she could have tried to appeal to the humanity of the people who were doing, taking the kids from the ghetto, or she could have done what she did, or she could have silently protested or angrily protested or any number of things, but she chose to do this. Chose to risk her life on a daily basis, smuggling kids out.
Right, and that's what makes something heroic, right? Is that there is, I mean, it's undoubtedly an active thing, right? Even if you're being reactive, you're still taking an action. You're doing something rather than nothing. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it might be, right? What we might have discovered in this half hour is that this doesn't buy me what I want it to, right? I just might not be getting what I want here, which is to find some sort of hard and fast rule that's always going to hold. There just might not be. But I want to get past value judgment.
Yeah. Well, so let's go back to the question I asked that you gave him as an answer to. Are there people you consider heroes that killed others? So let me give you an example. Nancy Wake, the Australian secret agent, freedom fighter in World War II. She's lauded as a hero, and in fact, I think one of her quotes is about strangling a Nazi soldier with her bare hands, and that's one of the things that people are like, yeah, she's what a hero. So, right. Is it the indiscriminate killing? Is it killing people that aren't directly trying to kill you? Is it, where's the line here?
Yeah.
Or is there a clear line?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I know. To be perfectly honest, I suppose, I mean, are there people who harm or kill others who are, yes, right, who are heroic? Like, I mean, the partisans in the Second World War, right? Every country had people fighting against the Nazis in the forest, right? What were those guys in Poland? The Bilski brothers.
The brothers, yeah.
Right? Yeah. I mean, if your target is a military target, and if those people that you're fighting against are villainous, then it seems fairly straightforward that one could be heroic and still be doing harm to people. The harm is narrow, right? It's focused, right? These aren't people who are going around indiscriminately killing Germans, right? Just to exact some sort of price against the regime, which is what McBride does, right? The idea is to terrorize and to hurt the regime in that way. So I think that would be the difference.
Yeah, and then I guess it comes down to, there's another sort of choice, or there's another designation that we need to be making on whether it's a war or not. Like, who gets to consider, or who gets to decide whether someone's in a war,
right?
And thus their decisions are fine, right? So is it okay for someone in under apartheid in South Africa? Is that the same situation as Nazi occupation, and is it the same as same situation someone in Syria as an ISIS member finds themselves? Who gets to decide?
Right. Yeah. Who gets to decide is a big question, right? And in a sense, it's back. I mean, it sort of brings us back to the same issue, right? That somebody is making this judgment call, but Yeah, right. I mean, if you look at all of the various Syrian rebel groups, for example, who are fighting against the Assad regime, and are some of them heroes? Are none of them heroes? Um, yeah, these are big questions.
Right, right, and similarly, going back a few decades to Basque separatists or the IRA. Yeah, are they at war? Are they at war because they consider themselves to be at war? So then, what actions are considered okay?
Right. Yeah. I mean, with war, in some sense, we can think of this. Maybe it's a little bit easier, right? Because there are rules, right? I mean, if you're in a war, there are still rules that you have to follow. I think you said this earlier in the conversation that ultimately, um, there are I mean, you can't indiscriminately target people. You can't kill prisoners. I mean, they're on and on, right? There's lots of these kinds of just war. These are very old rules. And we have the Geneva Conventions that sort of build on them. Um, so it isn't simply enough to say, well, we're at war, so anything is permitted. Very clearly, that's not true, right? So even if I keep coming back to the McBride situation because I've been writing about it. But even in that situation, someone who says, "Well, I'm at war," is nonetheless committing a war crime by bombing a bar.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I was going to get to that too. I think with Nancy Wake strangling a soldier who would have imprisoned or probably killed her, is different even to the Polish guys actively planning an attack on a target. And I don't remember the specifics with them, but they were more than just hiding and resisting. They were attacking back, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And at that point, they're not representing a government. They're basically trying to, as civilians, remove the occupying force. So then, are they beholden to the rules of war?
I would think so, right? I mean, it seems to me that waging a just war unjustly is nonetheless very problematic, right? That even if you're fighting against someone who's terrible, an aggressor who's committing war crimes themselves, it doesn't mean that one can commit war crimes in response, right? So if you want to, there's a difference between planning and targeting um, the war machine that you're trying to evict from your country, and instead, you know, um, attacking civilians who might be aiding um, the occupying power.
Right.
Right? That seems to me an important difference.
Yeah. So maybe we should leave it here and get our audience to take up any number of points that we've made here.
Yes, please do. Anyone who's out there listening, tell me if I should give up this line of inquiry entirely and just say that heroes are good people and villains are bad people, because heroes do nice things and villains do mean things. Obviously, I would say it in a better way than that, but that's kind of the heart of it. Or if there's something to this idea of um, heroism being emergent, heroism being reactive. And if you have ideas on where the chain of reaction starts, what counts and what doesn't count as a legitimate reaction to something, comment, let us know. We want to hear from you.
Absolutely. And you can do that on patreon.com/hero construction, where this will go first, or heroreport.com, where it will go second, or of course Facebook, Twitter, etc.
Absolutely.
So that's all for us for this episode. That's 3 in 1 month. There's even a
Not
danger
bad.
of doing 4 in 1 month. We'll see how we go.
Whoa. Whoa.
Well, one at a time.
Uh, Yeah. Look, I appreciate you letting me kind of run with this to see where it went. Obviously, I'm still in the early stages of thinking about this. I haven't committed anything to paper. And so this is all very kind of first look. But any ideas that you have, Matt, any ideas that our audience have, will be gratefully acknowledged when this paper ends up being finished.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks, Ari, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you. Have a good one.